Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to kind of shift our focus to, a region where peace feels more like a temporary truce
Hmm.
than something sustainable. We're talking about the Middle East,
Right.
and we're going to be looking at events in Gaza and Lebanon specifically, where these ceasefires are constantly, being tested.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to try to unpack the narratives,
Hmm.
surrounding these ceasefires to understand what's really going on.
It's like, I always imagine it as trying to build a house on a foundation of sand.
Right.
You might get a few walls up,
Yeah.
but the slightest tremor is going to bring the whole thing down.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And so let's kind of unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
We're seeing these so-called ceasefires in both Gaza and Lebanon.
Hmm.
But are they actually holding? I mean, take, for example, the January 19th ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza.
Right.
We just saw this Israeli airstrike in Beit Lahia on Saturday.
Mm.
They killed 9 people, including journalists and aid workers. That doesn't exactly, scream peace and stability.
No, it doesn't. And I think what's fascinating is how differently each side is portraying these events.
Right.
Um, it's more than just he said, she said.
Yeah.
It's really about understanding the motivations behind these narratives.
Right.
For example, the Israeli military, they're saying that they targeted terrorists who were operating a drone that posed a threat to their troops.
But Hamas is saying that this was a deliberate attack
Right.
on journalists who were just filming a Ramadan, dinner, basically.
They're calling it a massacre.
Yeah.
And it really begs the question, are these different accounts just attempts to control the narrative,
Yeah.
or are we talking about genuinely different perceptions of reality? And I think that's a crucial question.
Yeah.
Because it speaks to the deep-seated mistrust that fuels a conflict in the first place.
Yeah. And what about the implications of targeting journalists and aid workers regardless of the circumstances?
Oh, right.
This feels like a very dangerous precedent.
Absolutely. It blurs the lines.
Yeah.
And it raises really serious concerns about the protection of civilians,
Yeah.
especially, in a conflict zone where tensions are already unbelievably high.
Right. And it kind of all gets back to that initial question. What does ceasefire actually mean?
Right.
If these kinds of incidents keep happening?
Well, clearly, ceasefire doesn't necessarily equate to a complete end to hostilities.
Right.
It might mean a reduction in the large-scale fighting, but
Yes.
smaller-scale violence often continues.
Yeah.
And, without clear terms and effective monitoring,
Yeah.
it's almost like a ticking time bomb,
So you're saying these ceasefires are more like pauses in the fighting
Yeah.
rather than genuine steps towards peace?
In many cases, yeah, and that raises a critical question, I think, for you.
Okay.
What does it mean for the people who are actually living in these regions, who are caught in this constant cycle of hope and fear?
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine the psychological toll of living under that kind of pressure.
Yeah.
Never knowing when the next outbreak of violence might occur.
Right. Imagine just trying to go about your daily life,
Yeah.
raise a family, build some semblance of a future.
Yeah.
All while knowing that everything could change in an instant. I mean, that level of uncertainty and that kind of fear is incredibly damaging on its own.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And it seems like this fragile peace, if you can even call it that is playing out in Lebanon as well.
Yeah.
We saw that Israeli airstrike in Burj al-Maluk that killed 1 person just the other day.
Mm-hmm.
And it just kind of reminds us that the Israel-Hezbollah conflict is far from over.
Right. The November 27th truce between Israel and Hezbollah feels just as precarious as one in Gaza. And again, we see this pattern of tit-for-tat actions.
Yeah.
Israel conducting airstrikes against alleged Hezbollah operatives. Lebanon receiving released detainees from Israel. It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah, and all of this is happening against the backdrop of this delayed Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon. I mean, they were supposed to be out by February 18th.
Right.
But they're still controlling 5 strategic locations.
Right. And that's such an important point
Yeah.
because it illustrates the complexity of these so-called withdrawals.
Right.
One side retains control of key areas within the other's territory.
Yeah.
Can we really consider that a genuine step towards peace?
It seems more like a strategic maneuver, a way of maintaining control and leverage,
Yeah.
even while claiming to be seeking peace.
Exactly. And it's not just about the physical control.
Right.
It's also about the message it sends. It's
Right.
about, demonstrating power and maintaining this kind of sense of dominance,
Yeah.
which, can make it even harder to build trust and work
Right.
towards a genuine resolution.
So we're seeing these similar patterns of fragile ceasefires and ongoing tensions, both in Gaza and in Lebanon.
Yeah.
But is there any hope for a lasting peace in these regions?
It's a question that has haunted this region for generations.
Right.
And I think it's important to remember that any attempt at answering it needs to go beyond the headlines.
Yeah.
And the sound bites. Right. We have to look at the deeper historical context, the complex political and economic factors at play, and the human cost of these enduring conflicts.
Right, because it's so easy to just get caught up in the day-to-day events.
Yeah.
The latest airstrikes, the pronouncements from political leaders. But what about the everyday lives of the people who are caught in the crossfire?
Exactly.
How do these cycles of violence affect their lives, their well-being?
Imagine living in a place where the threat of violence is a constant companion.
Right.
Where, just the simple act of sending your kids to school or going to the market could have, life or death consequences. I mean, that kind of chronic stress can have a devastating impact on individuals, families, entire communities.
Yeah, it's not just the physical danger.
Right.
It's the erosion of trust.
Yeah.
The constant fear, the feeling that peace is always just out of reach.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to rebuild a society when those wounds run so deep?
It's a monumental challenge, but it's also where we find, I think, glimpses of hope.
Okay.
Because even amidst, the destruction and the despair, there are people who are working tirelessly to heal those wounds, to build bridges, to foster dialogue and understanding. They're the teachers, the doctors, the community leaders, the artists, the everyday people who refuse to give up on the dream of a better future.
Yeah. Their stories don't often make the headlines.
Right.
But they're the ones who are truly laying the groundwork for peace.
Precisely. They're the ones showing us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure and the desire for peace can persist.
So what can the international community do to support these efforts?
Right.
Is there a role for diplomacy and intervention in these deeply entrenched conflicts?
It's a complex question with no easy answers.
Right.
There's a history of both successful and unsuccessful interventions in the region. And I think one of the biggest challenges is finding that balance between respecting the sovereignty of these nations and recognizing the need to protect human rights and prevent further suffering.
It's a delicate tightrope walk trying to navigate the complexities of these situations.
Absolutely.
Without just, exacerbating the existing tensions.
It requires a nuanced understanding of the historical context, the political dynamics, the cultural sensitivities at play.
Right.
It's not about imposing solutions from the outside.
Right.
It's about supporting and empowering those local actors who are working towards peace from within.
So you're saying we need to move beyond these kind of superficial pronouncements of ceasefires and engage in a deeper, more meaningful dialogue.
Exactly. We need to move beyond the blame game, the tit-for-tat actions, and this kind of zero-sum mentality that's fueled these conflicts for so long.
Right.
It's about recognizing the shared humanity of all parties involved in working together.
Right.
To build a future where everyone can live with dignity and security.
It's a daunting task.
It is.
But it's clear that the status quo is simply not sustainable.
Right.
The human cost of these enduring conflicts is far too high.
And that brings us back to you, the listener.
Okay.
Because ultimately, change starts with awareness, with understanding, with a willingness to engage in these difficult conversations and to challenge our own preconceived notions.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that peace is not a passive state, but an active process that requires constant effort, dialogue, and a commitment to building a better future, however challenging that may seem. It can feel really overwhelming when we see these images of conflict and, we hear these stories about these tragic events. And I think a lot of people feel powerless in these situations. Like, what can I possibly do to actually make a difference?
I completely agree. It's easy to get caught up in that sense of despair. But change often starts at a very, grassroots level.
Right.
Those everyday acts of kindness, of understanding, of reaching out to someone with a different perspective.
Right.
Those all contribute to building a more peaceful world.
So what can our listeners do to engage with this issue in a meaningful way? Where can they go to find reliable information?
Sure.
And how can they actually contribute to this, global conversation?
Well, there are a lot of resources available, from reputable news sources to organizations that are working on the ground, in these conflict zones.
Right.
You can support these organizations. You can educate yourself about the historical context and the complexities of the situation.
Right.
And most importantly, I think you can engage in respectful dialogue with others, even those who may hold very different views.
Yeah, because ultimately it's about recognizing our shared humanity, right?
It is.
It's about seeing beyond the political divides and understanding that peace is not just the absence of war, but it's the presence of justice, equality, and opportunity for all.
Exactly. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe and secure, where their voices are heard, and where they have a chance to, build a better future for themselves and for their families.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into this precarious peace in the Middle East, we want to leave you with a sense of hope.
Yeah.
A belief that even in the face of these immense challenges, a more peaceful future is possible.
It is.
It requires effort, it requires understanding, and a willingness to engage in these difficult conversations.
For sure.
But as we've seen, there are so many people working tirelessly towards this goal.
Absolutely.
And even small actions can contribute to building a more just and peaceful world.
Remember, peace is not a destination.
Right.
It's a journey.
Yes.
And it's a journey we must all take together.